Okay, so the presentation that we made here last week was, as you show here, Salmon River Flood Hazard and Risk, what we know, what we don't know, and what we can do about it. And what we'll cover here is the basics of flooding, development on floodplains and deltas, impacts of floodplain and delta dynamics, flood control measures, and then we'll use the Salmon River and Salmon Arm as a bit of a case study. We'll look at some mitigation opportunities and some summaries of what you've presented, plus a few questions. So the basics of river flooding, essentially it's a natural process. It's nothing that hasn't gone on for eons. The basic process of flooding helps to dissipate the energy of the river and deposit sediment, including silt, sands, and organic materials onto the floodplain. And as a result of that particular process, it generates a rich and biologically diverse ecosystem within the floodplains and deltas. These areas have been known for many, many years as valuable for agriculture, and that's typically why we see, the predominance of farms throughout the world located on floodplains and deltas. As I was talking earlier, the GM Dawson recognized this, and this is a quote that he had out of his first expedition through the Red River area. Repeated flooding, however, has made soil extremely fertile, so rising waters are a blessing in the long term and a curse in the short term. And he recognized this as well as many other people, professionals, and people cultivating the land and developing establishments have recognized that for a long time. But as development and farming and support systems start to come into floodplains and deltas, our transportation systems have to come in. So we're constructing roads, road embankments, railway embankments, which was one of the first transportation systems through Salmon Arm. And along with those comes ditches, bridges, culverts, and land clearing, of course, to use the land for agricultural purposes. Those particular functions tend to trap the floodwaters. We're not really too cognizant how these things get laid out. We don't lay them out for the landforms. They get laid out on nice north, south, and east-west directions, which are fairly easy to survey. Then when floodwaters come into these areas, they encounter something that they've never encountered before, which is embankments. In other words, are just small dams, but extremely long dams, which have very few holes in them. Those embankments tend to redirect floodwaters. They tend to raise the floodwaters. They tend to keep things flooded for longer periods of time than they would normally. And they change the sediment transport and deposition of the river. So instead of being nice and uniformly deposited, they tend to interrupt the sediment supply and break it up into different areas. So here's an example of floodwaters being trapped by a road. Obviously it's flooding in from one side. The guy on the other side could probably start tilling up the field. That isn't the way it's supposed to behave. In the natural system, it wouldn't be behaving. Here's another example of what happens when you trap water behind a road. The water on the high side is only about 12, 14 feet deep. But the water is trapped up in behind there, flooding out several tens of square kilometers as a matter of fact. And then again, also the fish tend to get a little bit confused as to where they should be going when they start flowing, water start to flow up and down ditches. So when we build these systems of transportation systems and start developing on floodplains and in delta areas, this increase in flooding and severity of flooding and the impact of flooding gives rise to dike construction. So since we built this system of roads that cause the land to flood more frequently, now we run over and we try to elevate the dikes along the river. So now we try to put controls on the river. And it also gives rise to people trying to raise the land. So anything that's low, let's raise it up a bit higher because it floods. So again, unfortunately, we're not doing the right thing. We haven't really identified the problem. We're just treating symptoms. So here's an illustration of a typical river dike. One of the things you'll notice about that river dike, water's nice and high on the riverside, nice and low where they're trying to farm it and develop buildings and other things. But one of the things you will notice on that slide, there's no trees on it. And there's no trees on it for a reason. That's because planting trees on dikes isn't really an option. When you plant trees on dikes, those trees tend to degrade the stability of the dike by creating holes in the dike. And when the tree systems die off, the roots die off, you end up with little holes in them. And little holes in dikes can become big holes really quickly, and it gives rise to failures. Since I actually put this slide together in this little presentation, I was speaking to somebody who was down in Coeur d'Alene, and they have a quite an extensive diking system down there, which is very well vegetated and has lots of really beautiful hiking trails on it, with big trees on both sides of it. And now the engineers have told them, bad idea. We built a multi-million-dollar diking system here, and now you've created a very, very good likelihood that it's going to fail during the design event. But they're saying we have a multi-million-dollar trail system here too. So you have two things at odds. One is a dike that is designed to protect the infrastructure, and the other is a multi-million-dollar trail system. And if you're going to have that multi-million-dollar trail system on a dike that isn't going to work, there's no sense in having the dike in the first place. So now they're stuck with a multi-million-dollar cutoff trench to work with the dikes and the trees. And in other words, they got their backs up against the wall as to what to do about that.
Calvin, that's the Thompson River. Where is that?
I'm not exactly sure where in the Thompson River that is. Apparently along the north shore, according to the slide.
What about planting shrubs like willow, low-growing shrubs? Is that the same thing as planting trees?
It's the root penetration, and some fairly small roots. There's plants that will send roots down 100 feet. So you'd have to be very, very cautious with what you're going to plant. And then a low shrub is not going to provide riparian vegetation that streams need. You know, it may look aesthetically pleasing, but at the end of the day, it isn't going to provide the same thing as, say, a 50-foot cottonwood or something like that. So it becomes a bit of a gamble if you're going to spend millions of dollars doing a dike. It's going to become a bit of a gamble if it fails. So it becomes a problem there. Here's an example of a dike failure in 1948, which flooded the Fraser Valley, wiped out the railway track, and essentially you're looking at the 48 flood would be in the orders of tens of billions of dollars that occurred in today's dollars. The amount of damage that would occur in the Fraser Valley. And that's only the 48 flood. There's bigger floods out there. Here's an illustration of a dike failure in progress. And from that to total collapse would only be a matter of minutes. So what happens with rivers once we get into these types of training systems, they tend to also have to protect the banks of the rivers and the banks of the dikes with rock fill, or riprap as it's more commonly known as. And here's an example of a rip-wrapped area. And again, they discourage people from planting vegetation in there because it tends to destabilize the dike itself. So now your nice river system tends to start to look into these types of things. So here's a good example of what happens along the edges of the rivers. So this development of flood control measures results in maintenance and more flood control measures. So as a result of putting some of these dikes and dams and things in there, then we end up with increased damage to adjacent properties. Because if one farmer or one person can afford one thing, if the person downstream doesn't do it, this water will flow back uphill. It'll flow back around the dam. Technically it doesn't flow uphill, but it'll come back up the valley. Or if the dike doesn't get built above you, you built your nice little section of dike, but it isn't doing you any good. And as we dike things up, sediment gets trapped in there. We end up with higher dikes, more dikes, and then we end up into a dredging program, just like they have in the Lower Mainland. And then you end up having to put armoring in, and depending on how things work, you end up having to put in pump stations, because if you dike up one river, guess what? You're not going to do the same thing on some of the tributary streams. So you get water trapped on the inside of your dikes. So this becomes like, I knew the old lady who fell through the swallow the fly. It just gets progressively worse. There's an example of sediment trapped upstream of a culvert, undersized culvert on a stream. Sediment gets trapped upstream, and nature looks after things. When you starve it of sediment on one end, it takes the sediment from downstream. And essentially, you degrade the stream channels downstream of these locations. So in Whenever you trap things and you start to fool with Mother Nature has a way to adapt to things, and unfortunately the fish don't really care for those types of systems. This is actually where we do most of our work, actually make a living. Here's one on a fairly close by delta, known as BX Creek. This is right beside the highway. They have 2 culverts in there and a major sediment supply, all built up in BX Creek, which gave rise to about $1 million worth of dredging and repair work this last 2 years ago. And fish don't really care too much for dredging. It doesn't go well with their habitat. Another example in Vernon of a sedimentation being trapped inside of a channel area, no place for it to overflow its banks. It gets stuck, and essentially it has to be dug out. So you're looking at several tens of thousands of dollars because you have to actually manage the creek. You know, pumps have to be put in, dams have to be put in, you have to pump the creek around. And you need to salvage the fish that are in there. It has to be timed right, and then you have to take all the sediment away. So these types of dredging operations are not cheap. Again, and you don't even need to have closed bottom structures as in that previous slide. This is just a constriction on a creek. You see upstream, all the sediment's trapped upstream, just due to the constriction. Here's the solution that they did in Vernon with BX Creek. They turned one of their water dams that was no longer in need, intake structures, they turned it into a sediment control basin to try and keep the sediment from making its way down to the fan, causing problems in the areas that they've already developed. And this is what their sediment control basin looked like in the first year, full. So that's not going to be cheap to dig out every year. So why have society and civilization gone down this route time and time again? Because flood dynamics were not well understood, and people have short memories. As we see here, this is the 1894 flood in the Fraser Valley. This area is actually still fairly well developed. If you see where Chilliwack is there, that's what the rivers do during big floods. But we're relying upon, or that area anyway, is relying upon man-made dams and dikes and sediment and dredging, which costs money, maintenance, inspection, all of these things, armoring, all to try and keep Chilliwack and all the other surrounding communities in the lower mainland from being put underwater. And here's what downtown Chilliwack looked like in 1894. The land is no higher, but there's just a whole bunch of new buildings there now. And a significantly greater flood risk. So within the Salmon Arm area, one of the things to think about is, you know, we don't have a lot of history of these really bad photos, but I'll show you a few. But this type of activity here doesn't make the news. This is the farmer's field that's flooded. It's not really newsworthy, particularly if it happens on a regular basis. You know, the kids just go out and, you know, boat around in the field. This, unfortunately, as you saw in the video, does make the news, big time. It's of tremendous interest to everybody. And all the people there are now screaming to say, build the dikes higher, build them bigger, put in more dams, and control more water. As far as our memories go, here's a quote from Mary Balfe from the Museum and Archives in Kamloops. It says, "It's ironic that the museum exists to provide information about our past, and yet the weather officer is the only person who has ever researched the newspapers outlining the 1894 flood. Not a single developer, civic planner, or even prospective homeowner has ever bothered to check the records." People invest tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and never even bothered to see what happened in 1894. That costs a few $100s. And on the internet right now, this just takes 20 minutes to find a great article that Mary wrote about the floods of 1894. So if you've been to Kamloops, you may have seen this. 1999's waist level, 1948 shoulder height, 72 head height, and about 2 people above her is 1894. I think I'd be prepared to plan for that type of an event. And that event, according to Mary Balfe, as well as is it Ernie Doe? Yeah. pretty much put the Salmon Valley underwater.